Welcome and thank you for joining me. I am Verone and this is Just Another Voice. Today I'm going to be talking about Denis Villeneuve's recent adaptation of Frank Herbert's timeless masterpiece, Dune. A little late to the party, I know, but with the success of the Oscars this week, I figured this was as good a time as any to talk about it. This is a video I've had on my list since I started here, so I'm very excited to be giving it to you. I will warn you, there will be spoilers for the book as well as the movie, though I will avoid anything too major for the last third or so of the first book, which will be the basis of the next movie. But if that's what you came for, then buckle up and let's get started. Dune is undoubtedly an incredible cinematic achievement, one of my favorite films in quite a while. At the Oscars, it has won 6 awards out of 7 for which it was nominated, and it fully deserves each of them. Its directing, editing, cinematography, music, and production design were all innovative and utterly masterful at creating a completely immersive world that was utterly engrossing to watch, wholly unique, and thoroughly lived in, rich in depth and texture. It is also a pillar of what adaptation should strive to be in this day of appropriation and perversion of beloved materials, and for that alone, it wins my love. However, this movie is flawed. The biggest complaint I hear most people use to hold it back is that it feels like it is mostly just set up for the real story, but I'm not at all bothered by the chosen story format. Maybe it helps that I'm already familiar with the story and so I don't feel like it left me hanging because I already know how the story goes. I admit that, and I see how those who haven't read the books can find it an unsatisfying experience. But I do just see it as a chapter 1 of the Dune saga and judge it as that, rather than considering that a flaw. And it did its job very well. I would much rather it told the story of the book faithfully than twist it and make crap up in order to please a wider audience. If you've seen my first video here, you know my feelings on adaptation. I'm glad they structured it the way they did, giving Paul Atreides a trilogy to cover the rise and fall of his power. To be honest, I personally feel like the story structure they are bringing to the movies is an improvement on the books, where the third act of Book 1, which will be the focus of the next movie, felt like it was trying to cover all the massive climactic events as quickly as possible and tie off as many loose ends as possible in one scene while not actually showing so much of the action. There were multiple time jumps to get to the final battle as soon as possible, and then it only gave us the briefest glimpse of the battle itself before skipping to the aftermath, rendering it somewhat anticlimactic in my opinion. It came across to me as if Frank just wanted to wrap it up and keep it all in one book, and squished it at the end to do so, only to then realize Paul's story wasn't really over and tack on Dune Messiah. Not to say that's what really happened, but that's what it felt like, and it might be my only complaint with the first book. I think Denis giving the third act of the story its own movie will let it breathe as much as it needs to. But what is the problem I have with Dune? For me, the story felt incredibly rushed. It seemed they failed to do all the world building and character development needed to really appreciate what was happening because they skimmed through everything going on, leaving out some key subplots and leaving a few others loose. My family confirmed that this was the case because they, not being familiar with the story, had no clue what was supposed to be going on much of the time and had no investment in the characters because it was all in such a hurry to get things going. To me, it seemed that for the final cut, Denis was forced to cut absolutely everything that wasn't strictly necessary to progress the plot and lay down the barest basics of essential world building. My mom asked me to explain who everyone was because everything happened so fast and so many characters got so little screen time that she couldn't keep track of them and wasn't sure what purpose each of them played because, well, in this condensed version of the story, there are too many people for us to have time to come to know and care for them all, and not enough going on to justify all of their presence. I have heard many people talk about efficient storytelling, about conveying as much information in as little time as possible, cutting all excess fat and keeping the plot strictly to the point and avoiding needless side plots that don't contribute to the primary conflict as being the primary rule of storytelling. And I agree. But some might say that that is what this film is doing with the story, trimming fat and getting to the heart of it, doing as much as it can with as little time as possible. But I think this topic is much more complicated than that. In the case of this story, cutting some key subplots has removed much of the much needed character development and the entire purpose for some of these characters. For instance, what are the Mentats really doing in the movie? Would we notice if they were removed? Non-book readers certainly wouldn't. This version of the plot is much more lean, but in cutting so much of the supporting subplots, it has rendered much of what is left as vestigial appendages that no longer serve a clear purpose and don't have sufficient depth to justify them. When the Harkonnen attack began, it didn't feel to me like it had been sufficiently built up, since it didn't take the time to escalate the conflict and build the tension up to the sudden assault upon the house. In the book, the subplots that were cut from the film slowly ratcheted up the tension and sense of imminent danger up until the attack. At the same time, the whole conflict in the film was not so deeply personal to the Atreides family, and we don't see the painful toll that the stresses of this tenuous situation are taking on the characters and their relationships. All this because the story happens on such a grand scale that I believe it needs all these subplots to tie everything together and support its own weight, so to speak. The main plot is still there, but to me it suddenly feels very lacking, even empty. What it did almost flawlessly. I just don't think it did enough. But what if I told you that there is one major subplot that, if included in the film, could have done much on its own to solve all of these problems? There is one scene in this movie that serves very little purpose and which could likely be cut with fairly little consequence on the plot: the Hunter-Seeker incident. Paul is in his room when the Hunter-Seeker drone appears, and it takes all of his physical training to avoid its sensors and destroy it the moment it is distracted. A search then commences for the operator, whom they find sealed in the walls. This scene does two things in the movie. It demonstrates Paul's skill, and it breaks any illusion of safety that the Atreides might have had in their new home, revealing the lengths that their enemies have gone to strike at their heart. So it's still a very useful scene, but just within the strict progression of the plot, it's not particularly significant and doesn't have real consequences. Now let's compare that to the scene in the books. I don't remember exactly why or if the operator being sealed in the walls was even in the book, but the book version of the incident reveals a traitor to be in the midst of the Atreides' closest circle. I believe because it was clearly meant for Paul specifically and had to have been hidden by someone who knew that would be his room. Correct me if I'm misremembering. Anyway, all eyes quickly turn to the obvious suspect, the Bene Jesuit among them. Everyone suspects Jessica of plotting with her sisters for their own purposes. Everyone, that is, except Leto. Leto knows she would never betray them, much less assist the Harkonnens in murdering their son. However, he reluctantly pretends to be as suspicious of her as everyone else, so as to lull the real traitor into believing he is safe and hopefully draw him out. This, of course, puts a painful strain on their relationship when she discovers that he suspects her, and we no longer fear just for their safety, but for their relationship, for their family, and we see just how much Leto was willing to sacrifice for his loved ones. He watches in pain as a rift widens between them as a result of this whole situation, and he questions if all this plotting and intrigue is really worth the price. But, fearing what is coming, he entrusts Paul with the knowledge of his knowledge of Jessica's innocence, so that in case anything should happen to him before it is safe for him to open up to her, he can make sure she knows the truth. Of course, Paul is able to give his father's message while they are hiding in the desert, and the revelation that her beloved never in fact suspected her, but was willing to endure her thinking he did for her own safety and died bearing that burden, is what breaks her emotional barriers and allows her to finally grieve his death. This subplot that didn't make the final cut of the film cranks up the tension of the whole situation and makes the stakes deeply personal to the characters, reveals so much about them, and provides the most tender moment of the entire book. Its absence from the movie was very much felt by me. But this isn't all it did. It also provided most of Thufir Hawat's purpose in the story, as he was Leto's closest confidant and advisor throughout this whole situation, and the only one besides Paul who he trusted completely, because, as his mentat, he couldn't afford not to, and believing his master to be blinded by his feelings, Thufir sets out on his own to determine if Jessica is in fact the traitor as he suspects, leading to an epic confrontation of mentat and Bene Gesserit mental abilities that I would have loved to see depicted. And because of this whole situation, both he and Gurney Halleck are left believing she was responsible for the Harkonnen attack by the end of Act 2. setting up the motivation for their actions in the final act of the story. Which reminds me, this movie also leaves a number of loose ends with its side characters, who my family thought were all dead by the end because we don't see their fate. To be fair, Denis may have wanted it to appear that Gurney Halleck had died to reveal him in the next film, so sorry if that's a spoiler, but I don't see why that would have been done with Thufir, and we should have seen him given to the Baron as a gift at the end to replace Pieter de Vries. And while there's no reason they couldn't believe Jessica to be responsible for the Harkonnen attack in the next film, that belief just wouldn't make as much sense because we won't see what reason they had to be so sure that there was a traitor high in their ranks. So that is how I would have fixed Dune, just leaving that one subplot in the film. However, I'm not blaming Denis Villeneuve for this, as we know from all sorts of sources and evidences that there was a lot of material shot that did not make the theatrical cut, and some of the subplot might have been among it. It's rumored that the original cut may have been anywhere from 3 to 4 hours long, and I am one who is strongly hoping for an extended edition to be released. To my knowledge, none of the home video releases included much extra footage, but maybe someday we'll see the film that this deserved to be. Anyway, that's all I've got for you today. If you liked what you saw, please like, subscribe, and share this video with anyone you know who loves Dune. Until next time, never stay silent.